All right. Let's start this thing.
Go for it.
All right. Welcome to today's discussion with Mike, Patti, and Sam Estes from Cinesamples on the topic of sampling instruments. Cinesamples have been a pioneer in the development of virtual instruments for over a decade, creating some of the most playable and well-recorded libraries to date. I couldn't think of a better group of guys to take us on a journey behind the creation of these libraries. Why don't you guys tell us a little bit about yourselves?
Sure. Well, I'll go first.
No, I was saying kick it off.
Okay. Yeah. All right. Well, my name is Mike Patti. I founded Cinesamples about 12 years ago. Originally, I've always been a composer and initially needed some new tools to write the kind of music that I write for film, television, media, doing mock-ups. We decided to start going into a studio and start building virtual instruments and kind of as a side gig. And I kind of turned into this thing that was bigger than we thought. And now it's like a proper company. And we've been doing this for, over a decade. I can't believe it's been that long. So, Sam.
Yeah, I started my career working for Junkie Excel as his first studio assistant back in 2006, and then went in to run Hans Zimmer's private sound design sampling, whatever you would call it, portion of remote control productions, where I worked with a lot of the major film composers in town, developing more bespoke private libraries for them, and then joined Cinesamples in 2012. Took a brief hiatus in 2014 to start a company called Amper Music, where we built out an AI music software and platform, developed over 8,000 instruments for that platform in the course of basically 4 or 5 years. And now I'm back with Cinesamples and happy to be back with Mike and continuing the technological development of creating all these tools for composers, and really excited to keep moving the needle forward.
Yeah. So Justin, I was gonna have a quick little, just to give people context and understand what Cinesamples is if they haven't know anything about it.
Sure, go for it.
And I'm gonna try to share my screen here.
Okay.
So yeah, we've been doing this for a while.
Yeah, you guys started out with Cinetoms, was it? Was it the first one you pushed?
First thing we did was a harp library in
Okay.
a small studio in New York.
Gotcha.
And we're based in. Someone asked a question. Can I answer questions if they pop up here?
Oh, for sure, definitely.
Yeah, it's based in Los Angeles. Most of our recordings are on the scoring stages here in LA. We've done the whole symphony orchestra at the MGM scoring stage. It's the big one at Sony Picture Studios.
Right.
All right, the screen share is not working for some reason, but that's okay.
Yeah, if you go on Cinesamples website, you can go through different products and you can see there's a background video on just about all of them showing, everything from recording all the way through sampling and creating the final product. it's pretty amazing to see.
We started off doing a lot of smaller libraries, but the biggest one that we did was in 2011, which kind of kicked things off, was a brass library called Cinebrass. We did it at stage, and we got to work with Dennis Sands. He's a fairly prominent scoring editor. Worked with Alan Silvestri and Danny Elfman, and so he brought all his gear and his decades of experience and working at the Sony scoring stage for forever, and applying what he knows about recording.
Gotcha.
And bringing that to the virtual instrument world. So we started with Cinebrass, and that was kind of a big success, much more than we thought. And we only set out to just do the brass, but because it was a success, we were like, hey, all right, let's go back. Let's do the rest of the orchestra, woodwinds, and then we did percussion, and we did strings, pianos, and a whole bunch of stuff. And so as of last year, we just finished up pretty much everything you could think of that you would need as a composer of orchestral music.
Right.
Sampled at the Sony scoring stage.
So could you break down the product a little bit more? What are the samples? Are they individual samples be played? Is it runs? Is it sections? lots of articulations. Can you kind of dive into what all's involved in one of the instrument sample libraries?
Sure. Well, we can talk about the process, but if you don't know, a virtual instrument is a replication of a real instrument from thousands and thousands of individual audio recordings of every possible articulation within an instrument, shorts, longs, staccatos, and you do different dynamic layers, and we'll do different legatos, which we can talk about, to get those sort of transitional material to make it sound as realistic as possible. And we ship them in a format that's very popular right now called Contact. So it takes a lot of programming and scripting to get it into this format. And we do that so that it's playable using a MIDI keyboard on your computer. So you either use a MIDI keyboard, or you can use it within any DAW and compose within a MIDI sequencer. And the idea, like the philosophy behind Cinesamples is always to keep things very simple and easy to use. Because I'm a musician. I'm not a super technical person. I want things to just work. And that's always been, I don't want to be messing around with trying to find that right articulation or spending that extra 10 minutes just trying to get something to sound realistic. I want it to just work.
Right.
And as a keyboardist, that is kind of how we program things. And so,
right.
Yeah, it's, yeah.
Do you want to take us through the process of how you guys go from concept to delivery?
I'll let Sam take over there.
Yeah. All right. So, obviously there's the entire marketing and user stuff and all that kind of stuff. So let's assume all that's been done. We've looked at, our costs and all that stuff. The first thing we do is analyze what exactly it is we want this library to do. How do we want it to function? When we think of samples as individual tiny performances, which is what they are, you want to have a very lifelike, response. And so each library does something very specific and usable for any number of styles of music that you're writing in, whether if it's pop or rap or, symphonic, small symphonic, large symphonic, big film scores. It doesn't matter what it is, but each library will be best suited for doing a thing. And so that's what we analyze. We try to say, okay, are we going to go for a very specific thing, or are we going to go for a more broad reach? Okay, so if we're going to go for a broad reach, what is it exactly that we need to capture in order to get to, what we call minimum viable product, something that's going to be able to be used. So that's kind of the first step, is like, okay, what do we want to do? And then after we've figured out what that is, we start looking at all the components that are going to be broken down. Which instrumentation, what musicians, what stage are we going to record it in? What articulations are we going to capture? So for instance, we talk about a solo violinist. We look at a solo violin, we go, okay, in order to make this thing expressive, we need to record 3 to 4 dynamic layers. We need to look at the types of attacks that they want to do. Is it a slow attack? Is it a hard attack? Is it on the string? Is it off the string? We look at the releases. We go, do they take the bow off? Do they taper? And so we start breaking down every single little component that can make a solo violin and start checking the boxes of, okay, let's record this, let's record this, let's record this. And then we start building out a very lengthy timesheet of, okay, it's going to take about this amount of time to record these articulations with these round robins. A round robin is basically the same note recorded at the same time, or at the same dynamic, to give a little bit of life and variance to the sound. In case you guys don't know what round robins are, calculate how many round robins we're going to do. And so that gives us a general punch down list for a recording session of how long everything's going to take. We build in stuff like rest time and bad notes, and figure out exactly, like, okay, we have 3 hours to record this thing. These are the articulations we're going to be able to get in. These are kind of the bonus articulations. If we can get to those, great. If we can't, oh well. So we try to run a very, very efficient session to try to get everything in, because we don't want to waste our time and our engineers' time, as well as the musicians' time. So we try to make that very compact. We also look very much at like what's tiring for musicians. So if you're looking at a brass player, you don't want to start them out fortissimo, because then the rest of the session they're dead, right? So we worked very closely from what we know as being musicians. Mike's a string player and keyboardist. I'm a woodwind player, a vocalist, and a keyboardist. So we have a pretty good understanding of kind of what the limitations are. And it's the same thing you would do in a scoring session too. And then from there we record, put everything into Pro Tools, make notes as we go on what articulations we're doing, kind of adjust the session a little bit. If we're going a little long, we go, okay, let's cut a couple dynamics. These are the not so important stuff. So we kind of adjust as we go along. We have a whole Pro Tools session that's easily marked with bad samples and good takes. We have, at least 12 different microphones that we set up so we can kind of build a mix later or have options for users to build mixes. And then from there, we take it back to the studio, kind of do our finessing and final editing to get everything into a sizable chunk that we can start editing. We pull it into an editor that we use to start cutting all the samples, denoise them, tune them, loop them, normalize whatever it is that we need to do to these samples to get them exported, to get them imported into something like Contact. And then from there, once it's in Contact, we look at GUI, we look at UX, we start building out wireframes. We talk to scripters, get the scripters involved, because you could have a very simple instrument where you play the keyboard, it's just a set of samples. Those are great instruments. We love those instruments. They're the easiest to build, but in reality, we never make those instruments. So we have to figure out really interesting ways of scripting the technical requirements that we want to have for each library that we want to put out, so our scripters know exactly what's happening. And then we get it all together. We get a team of beta testers, start testing the product, make tweaks, really make sure every single sample's in the right space, is not too noisy, is tuned properly, is playing back at the right point when you play the keyboard. You don't have space or it's not cut in too much. And we go through a very, very large QC process, quality control process, before we actually upload it to either our servers for distribution or to Native Instruments or whatever platform that we're going to be using. So that is the gist of how we make samples.
Piece of cake.
Yeah, and it can take anywhere. The most simple instrument we can turn around and get on a website in, 2 to 3 weeks. The most complicated ones should take between 6 months and a year.
Right. Well, Sam, you answered probably a third of my questions within 5 seconds there. Yeah. So while we're on the topic of pre-production, what is the process of acquiring, just the cash flow to start something, like an orchestra sampling project? I mean, it's a massive undertaking. Do you have any advice on doing that kind of thing to anybody ever interested in doing such a task?
Oh, God. Well, yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And,
Right.
I think we were fortunate because we never took out loans or anything.
Right.
We just kind of the first library we did was $700, which was a lot of money for me and my partner at the time.
Right.
That harp library. We just took most of the profits and put it back into the next one and then built something a little bigger. And then we took the profits and built something. We did it very slow and kind of old fashioned.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But, if you don't have experience with sampling, I wouldn't recommend borrowing money from grandma or something.
Oh, no.
And doing it, because there's so much that we've messed up on in the past that on smaller projects that we can learn and get really good.
Oh, yeah.
Well, and it's also, I've been sampling since the 90s, believe it or not.
Wow.
Not real sampling, but I started doing sampling in the 90s, but I went into it full force, obviously working for Hans and developing a large portion of his library. I was not the only developer on his library, to be fair and to not take full credit. And he has a whole team of people that work on that. But I think that's really kind of what kicked it off for me in understanding how to make the workflow better. Because a lot of people's workflow, it's you record into your favorite DAW, whether if it's Reaper or Pro Tools or Cubase or Logic or DP. Hopefully I didn't miss any big ones there. FL Studio. And start, editing each individual sample and then having to name every single individual sample and try to loop stuff. And it's a nightmare.
Right.
And so developing tools and software to try to get it, streamlined was basically what I did, and worked with some really amazing developers throughout the process, not only
Right.
with Hans, but also with Cinesamples and with Amper. So it's all about trying to get tools to help us do the things that we need to do. And I know there's a great set for Reaper out there right now. For those of you who aren't familiar with Reaper, it's a kind of a programmer's DAW in some ways. But there's a lot of really, really good tools for editing and looping and naming. And that's slowly becoming the DAW of choice for a lot of people.
So on the topic of naming files, I mean, from my own experience, that was probably the biggest headache for developing libraries, was just labeling 50,000 files, and I would do it to the key mapping settings, in Contact. And I mean, I just couldn't find any way of doing that efficiently because of all the different articulations. And I mean, it just basically became a manual task.
Yep.
I mean, would you care to discuss like a product that goes into that kind of efficiency?
Well, there are. I mean, we have some of our own internal tools that we use to mitigate those things.
Right.
But right now, the most available is the Reaper. The plugins. I forget the name of the guy who's been building them currently.
Gotcha.
But there's some really all you have to do is do a Google search for sampling methodologies in Reaper or something like that.
Gotcha.
To get it forward. But there are some auto naming conventions you can do in Pro Tools. One of the first early things I did was I set up a program called Quick Keys, which is a automated, basically a keystroke, macro editor, and built in a massive if-then statement with a lot of tokens that I would program out and say, okay, this is a 6 microphone position with 3 round robins going up a scale starting on C on whole tone, and I put those things together and then press go, and it would just name everything using Command R and basically go through every single region, naming the stuff, and then I'd export it and throw it into our samplers. But that is a very cumbersome way of working and is wrought with errors because Pro Tools likes to interrupt OS level background things and stop.
Yeah, I didn't find it to be the best.
So, but yeah, I mean, there are ways forward, and there's tools that we develop. Kind of to step back one quick second. While sampling an orchestra is a really bad idea from a financial standpoint and trying to get it out there, I do recommend that everyone does sample, though. I think it's highly important not only to your own abilities, but it also helps get you to a point of understanding what it's like to actually use your samples, especially from a composition standpoint or from a mixing standpoint. When you're blending samples together, like, what is the noise floor actually doing? What are my transient responses? Where are the buildup of frequencies in these samples that maybe I need to go back and EQ? So understanding that kind of stuff, getting your hands dirty and making a simple, one layer instrument is very valuable. Plus it's yours, it's your own sound. It's something you can put in and work with. So anyways, that was my 2 cents.
I actually built sample libraries back on Giga Studio.
Oh, nice.
So did I.
Sampler, the original Giga sampler.
Yep.
And realized very quickly that was not my calling in life, because the amount of time that it took, and these were all single layer squeeze box type samples, things like that were not very intricate, and it's just the amount of time that you'd have to invest to get everything right. Not my thing. And so for you guys to put together these multi-layer, just crazy sample libraries, it's amazing. It really is. And there's a couple questions in the chat area also. One of them is talking about, do you sample every note, or are you doing pitch changing up a tone, down a tone, stuff like that?
That's part of when we're doing that kind of analysis going into the project. What is important, and some of that, a lot of that has to do acoustically. So get in the audio engineering portion of this thing. When you look at string instruments have a resonant body that is constantly there. So piano, harp. Dulcimer, mallet-based instruments where it has resonation in the instrument. As soon as you start stretching those notes, it totally destroys the entire aspect of the instrument. So when we're looking at the resonant-bodied instruments, those we always sample chromatically, unless we're doing some sound design library. I shouldn't say always. There's never an always, but but if we're looking at something like a string or a violin or something, you can get away with stretching, down a minor second or a major second, and up a major second or a minor second. And so you can actually get away, and it sounds just fine, especially if you're round robining the samples. You can really get around some of those artifacts that are created from speeding up and slowing down the samples. And ideally, we can come up with some other sampling technologies that allow us to stretch and make stuff sound better in reproduction. But
and sometimes it's budgetary reasons. Like with brass is very difficult to sample because they're very difficult instruments to play for an extended period of time. Hey, play triple forte for 3 hours. So we'll give them a break by only doing whole steps. And brass tends to work out okay for whole steps. You can fake the rest of them pretty well.
Is the entire sampling process done with a conductor usually present, or is it to a click?
If there is, my rule of thumb, if there's more than 3 people in a room, there's always a conductor. It helps with communication. It helps with having an ear and a voice in the room that can immediately get to something instead of just being in the cans, and also helps them feel a little bit more connected to the process that they are performing samples and not just kind of going through a chart. Anything like basically at 3 is when I make that decision. Every once in a while we've had 4 people in the room. I'm just like, just go. You guys are pros. And we set up a click track and they're just going through the chart. But yeah, typically we always have click though, because click helps us time out, especially when we're dealing with, an RT response in a room of, like a second or 2 seconds or 3 seconds. And we don't want to overlap the notes. We can set up our click so we know exactly, what the RT response is. And we're making all the notes work just perfectly. So we don't have too much. Yeah, it helps with editing. So we don't have too much dead space, or we're not overlapping the samples.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. We have a couple more questions. So how many employees does Cinesamples have? And are you guys outsourcing, work ever, like scripting or GUI or anything like that?
Yeah, well, we have, what is it? We're up to 10 or so full time, give or take.
Roughly, yeah.
Something like that. And then we have contractors that but we need that. Well, we were down to about 3 employees a couple of years ago, but now we're coming back. So we're growing and hiring. So.
Yeah. So if you are a GUI or a scripter, please ping us, because we're always looking for good people, and we have a lot of projects coming down the pipe. We're always open and willing to look at people, and we are I guess we are an international, multinational company now, if you include Canada, in terms of our employee base. So you don't have to be based here in LA to be working with us.
All right. So let's move on to a little bit more on the recording process. Could you discuss a little bit about the different microphone techniques and placements that you guys, generally gravitate towards?
Mike, you want me to do that, or you want to start?
Go ahead.
Okay. Okay. So again, it's very, very dependent on the room, the instrument, musician, what the quality of the library is that we're doing. So obviously, if we're doing a larger orchestral library, we want to have a couple of microphone positions, like a close microphone or maybe a spot microphone, so we can get that kind of edgy, more diggy sound. Somewhat of a close microphone in the typical kind of section replacement placement, tree position, where we'll use either your standard 3-position tree, I prefer to use the Blumline in a lot of room mic situations. I think that's getting that response actually gives us a lot of good initial reflections off the walls that helps us build reverbs. We'll often have some really far mics or very diffuse mics, usually pointed at a wall, to just give us, almost no direct sound that we can either blend into the samples or blend 100% into reverb to even create a bigger space, especially depending on the space that we're recording in. If we're going to a grain silo, the whole point of being in a grain silo is to capture the grain silo. So we'll adjust the mics as we go forward. But the rule of thumb is anything less than 6 microphones, it's not a recording session for me, because we really want to have options as we come back into the studio, because it could be there's one mic that is just so noisy we can't denoise it. There's too much going on, or it got woofy or whatever, but I have an alternate mic I can go to grab. But in terms of like ribbon mics, yeah, I love using ribbon mics, but that's highly dependent on the instrument. Just like with any recording process, it's like use the right tool for the right job. Put your ear where the mic's going to go, and say, yeah, I think that's going to work there. And then also just use the history and the knowledge that you have in the rooms that you're going to and the gear that you're using, like you would in any normal session.
Do you guys use much outboard gear usually, or you just kind of keep it a clean signal?
It depends on the session and what we're trying to go for. I typically don't use any outboard gear, because when you're dealing with samples, you're dealing with layering, a dynamic recording set. So, you could have one sample, you could have 50 samples all from the same recording session, all layered together. And so noise floor can be a huge problem. And so a lot of what we need to do is kind of to take stock of like, okay, well, is this, tube microphone, or is this EQ, or is this compressor doing something funky to the samples, where if we started layering everything together, are we going to get that response that we want? Or is it better to do it after you've put all the samples together in your DAW or in your playback engine to actually start doing the processing on those samples?
Right. Or give the user the ability to just have at it.
Yep.
Right. That's always been my philosophy.
Yeah. Well, I was just going to say, like, from the composer perspective, you want to just have it be, because if there's too much stuff on the sound, then you can't edit it. Like some complaints from other virtual instrument companies, it tends to be a little bit too wet. And hopefully we've captured that middle ground where it's just enough, wet meaning too much verb from the room. And so it's been good. And the thing is, it's also in terms of microphone placement, as far as orchestral instruments, you want to capture their location in the room.
Right.
You have the decatry, and you have your wides, and then your surrounds, and that's pretty much like 80% of the sound. And the only thing that changes is their location in the room.
Right.
So that way, across the board, from a composer standpoint, all of the instruments are going to be the same, recorded the same. It's just their locations are different.
Just fall into place naturally.
Yeah.
I never understood the developers that, just mic everything to where it's like center, just to get the biggest sound, I guess, out of each thing. And then it's kind of spatial placement tool afterward.
Yeah, well, and there's something to be said about that methodology as well. That's a very kind of Vienna ensemble approach, or there's several. I don't want to pinpoint any specific library, but there's something to be said about like giving the user the ultimate control versus giving them enough control to get them in trouble versus no control at all. And like Mike said, I think we're in that middle range where, we are kind of baking in some of that panning. But, you still have the ability, if you want to go to Tchaikovsky, layout of your orchestra, where you have first violins over here and second violins over here, you can get that wide spread by just, swapping your microphone position. Yeah, so you still have options. You still have ways of moving things around, and you can take close mics and, then move those around. So your close mics may not be in perspective, but your tree and everything else in the room. Plus you also get the buildups in the room from the location of the basses versus the violins. So you can get a much more natural approach to the sound. And there's a lot of history behind where we've placed these instruments to begin with. So we've got that on our side in terms of panning into the samples to begin with.
I mean, dude, I would just say the general philosophy is that things have to be recorded well. like that you can't compromise there, because you can't, trying to fix a mediocre recording after the fact is never the way to go. Like, oh, let's just do the small room with the cheap microphones and we'll just, try to fix it in post. It never works.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
worth going that extra mile and hiring the right people.
Yep.
Getting the right room. Because then you're just saving yourself a lot of headaches.
Yeah, get the right samples, and really bake into your sampling time schedule of like, look, we're gonna miss 30% of these samples. Let's build in enough time to where you can go back and that wasn't quite in tune, or that wasn't quite the right dynamic. Let's redo this little segment. So there's a lot of samples we throw out. Not every sample is right. Not every sample is sacred. There's the good samples that are slightly performed, maybe a little out of tune, maybe a little late. Not everyone's coming together, but that's also life in the samples. So there's this fine line we're always riding of like, is this unusable, or is this just at the right point of being wabi-sabi usable? And so there's an interesting dynamic there of kind of sample selection.
Now, what you were asked, or you were speaking about delivering the samples to the consumer, the end user, and having it be processed. You don't want it too processed, but you want it enough that it sounds good. I've run into something where I'm primarily a mix engineer, and I get stuff in every day from all over. And one of the main problems I run to immediately, because I do rock stuff, pop, folk, that type of stuff, not classical, is kick drums. Mm-hmm. And people will always trigger and use a kick drum sample that sounds phenomenal on its own. And as soon as I get it, I have to re-trigger it with something that actually works in the song. Mm-hmm. And so I really track down things such as people will go buy the Tommy Lee kick drum sample pack, which of course on its own sounds massive and huge. And you put it in a song and it completely disappears because it's just bottom and top, no mid. And so as a sampling company, how do you deal with that? Because the end user goes and tries out the sample at the website or downloads it. And in the case of like a Tommy Lee kick drum, well, this sounds fantastic. So they buy it. If it actually sounded the way it needed to sound to fit into a song, they'd be like, well, that sounds terrible. I'm not buying this. You know what I mean?
Very much so.
Yeah. How do you guys deal with that balance of getting it so it sounds great, but it's not hyped and unusable?
Yeah, no, we've done this on some of our stuff. Like we work with Tina Guo. She has a cello library that we made. She's a pretty well-known cellist. And in that library, you have two choices. You have sort of the produced mix, which is just sounds kind of great out of the box. And then there's the raw, just straight from the board. And you can kind of just switch between the two of them. So say, you have an engineer who's needs the original raw. Well, you just switch it to that and bounce it out. So like that's something that I think is important.
Well, and I think what's also important is that we're using our libraries. So, part of the QC process, we have a wide range of, composers and producers that are using the libraries and giving us feedback. And, not only do Mike and I sit down and use the libraries, go, is this useful? Did we go down a rabbit hole here we shouldn't have? Because we're constantly asking ourselves those questions. But, from the 20 years or so of experience, we're typically getting to the point of like, okay, if we go down that rabbit hole where all it is, a bunch of low, really punching in the low and a little bit of tick at the high end, what is our market? What are we going for with this? Is someone just needing these samples to just kind of lay in, or are they wanting to actually use the samples? And for me, I'm always opting for the most usable types of samples. And if I can't use the library, I don't want to release it. Right. Or if our QC people can't use the library, this is not something releasable. Because it's all, in the end of the day, it's all about, being able to build stuff that's usable for, a wide range of skill sets and people who are out there on the marketplace. Because ultimately we're servicing you guys. We're servicing the people who need to use the products. We're trying to build tools that, get people to where they want to be faster. Get people inspired. It saddens me to see composers sitting there spending 80% of their time mixing samples instead of actually writing music, because 80% of that time getting into mixing samples and trying to make the stuff sound right is not, I mean, yeah, you spend 20% of your time composing for that sample set. You know, you could have at least 60% more of that time actually developing good melodies and better chord progressions and better orchestration, you know.
Yep. And your song good.
Yeah.
I've fallen into that trap myself.
Fantastic. We have a couple of questions, so let's jump into the Q&A sections.
Sure.
Actually, this was one of my questions, but we'll do it now. Since it's on here. You guys were talking about Kontakt and the various things you have to do and hoops you have to jump through. Are you going to stay with Kontakt, or are you going to move to your own sampler at some point?
I think we're definitely sticking with Kontakt for the foreseeable future. And I guess I will say we are definitely considering a sampler in the future. That's all I can say.
That's a huge endeavor.
Yeah.
Because of licensing and everything too. So, wow.
Yes. Well, software development is a whole other beast, right?
Yeah, no kidding.
And hit or miss with some developers, right?
Yeah, we keep looking at the history of you know, a lot of the developers making their own sample libraries, and we keep asking ourselves, is this really something that we should try to make an endeavor in? Like, is this worth it? Or, you know, is Kontakt servicing the needs of the industry, and is this their development roadmap steady? I mean, there are other great samplers out there too. We've dabbled a little bit in UVI sampler, which is now known as Falcon. It used to be known as Mach 5. It's a great sampler. It's really easy to use. I enjoy using it from a sound design standpoint. I think it just sounds great. But Kontakt is the adopted standard. We also have EXS. EXS is coming back in Logic. They've been putting a lot of development into it. I'm really cool and stoked, because EXS I used alongside with Giga Studio before we started venturing into Kontakt. I loved EXS. It was such a simple, great sampler. So, you know, especially when you're making your own samples, and if you are on the Logic-based system, that's a great little tool. And I would highly encourage anyone using it. I know Andrea very well, who's developing it on the Apple team, and I'm very excited and encouraged to see what they're coming up with. So there are other options out there besides Kontakt, but Kontakt is the industry standard, and that's what we're using right now. Yeah,
I tell you, it's a daunting endeavor, though, you know, to go down that road, and because these other companies have started releasing their own sampler, it's been challenging. You know, some have had different levels of success, and you know, composers are very picky customers, right? Like, we wanted this thing to just work, and if there's crashes, if there's inefficiencies, you know, composers are going to let you know about it.
Yeah,
so, right. You know, that's something that we really, if we're going to do that, we have to make sure we nail it. So, yeah, it's tricky.
All right, so let's start talking about scripting and the way the samples actually work in the player, if you don't mind. Let's see. So your Legato scripts, haven't they changed over the years a little bit from the original iterations of your orchestra?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of. Sam can talk. He can go all like talk forever about this, but I would say there's probably 2, maybe 3 different methodologies for Legato.
Gotcha.
There's the one which is the easiest, which is you sample the initial starting sustain, you know, say it's a middle C, and then you sample, you know, another sustain, right? And then you have to capture that sort of just middle, you know, let's say it's C to G, you know, the perfect fifth. And it's just, you know, just right, and it stops. Start note, end, and then cuts off. And then in the script, it just crossfades from that first sustain into that transition very quickly, and then crossfades out the top of the transition into the next sustain. Gotcha. So it's like 3 samples, right?
And you only get about 50 to 150 milliseconds of sample time between the 2.
Yeah, so that's methodology 1.
Right.
There's another one which takes a lot longer to record, which is where you have the starting note, and you have the transition sample to the next note, but it stays on the next note. So it will just, this is what we did with the Tina Guo Legato. You start here, and then we had her do the transition and then just stay and then she just changed her bow, I think 3 or 4 times,
Right.
and then she would do the next transition, the major sixth, blah, 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 blah. And, but that does sound a lot more realistic because you don't have to deal with the transition at the top. And then isn't there a third one? Sam?
So the third one's the fake legato. That's where you're actually
Yeah.
stretching or pitch stretching the sample, and just kind of like a monosynth.
Right.
So, and there are some sample libraries that actually use a combination of the two. There's actually a fourth one, which is it's kind of like the second one Mike mentioned, but it's just like scoops into the sample, so or drops into a sample, so there's no actually defined pitch. And so this was utilized way back in Giga Studio days. It was a technique we were using to try to get some kind of life into the sample. So you play the note real hard, so you hit basically a high velocity, and you kind of get this like movement of the note. So it kind of sounded real. I think we did it on one of the guitar instruments for Hans, or I did it like internally in Giga Studio. I didn't do it for Hans, but I did it for myself on one of his guitar libraries. So that's another method. So there's upsides and downsides. There's financial upsides to the first method of just all we have to do is just sample all those little transitions. But from a playback, you guys, all of you understand RMS very nicely and very well, and it wreaks havoc on trying to blend and you get these like bumps in the legato. You get it's just like, oh, that sample was not right. But as soon as you bring up the bass note or bring down the transition note or whatever, and then all of a sudden it's too quiet, and you're always kind of dealing with that aspect. The other thing that stinks about that other thing is that the ending note not only has to be in tune properly, but it has to last just long enough for the room that you've recorded in for the tail to disappear into the actual sample. And so you have to figure out what your masking effect is to figure out like how long should the sample actually last. And if it's a quiet sample, it's not going to last that long. But if it's a super loud brass sample, it's got to last a long time. But now I've got phase problems with not only the high frequencies of brass instrument. Okay, I'm going on into a rabbit hole, but you get what I'm saying. Yeah. The second methodology is my preferred methodology. It takes much longer on the stage to record, but we don't have to deal with especially those transitions. We get nice the proper room decay. We get the proper room interaction with the instrument itself. You get a lot of those enharmonic tones that come out of the instrument interacting with the room. And it works a lot better for a very, very specific set. Now, if you want to start getting super complicated, then you got to do, well, what if it's a fast transition? What if it's a bow change legato? What if it's a rearticulation tongue versus a breath control versus, and there's just an infinite amount of ways to try to reproduce the instrument. But the name of the game in sampling is it's next to impossible to deliver all that to your customers. What you have to do is make a library that's going to do a specific thing. And in this instance, this is what this library is really good at. This is how you're going to use this library. If you want to do something else, maybe you should look at this other library. Right. And that's also the beauty of sampling, because we have an infinite amount of things that we can sample and an infinite amount of approaches that we can take to developing these libraries for specific use cases. Maybe there's something in the Tina Guo library that's not quite hitting it right, and we should record something with her doing something else that's maybe like for faster passages or whatever it is. And we'll approach it from a different perspective.
So Mike, I actually found out how to get that you to be able to share your screen. So there's a little button under my share screen to allow panelists to, so you should be able to now.
Okay. Well, I don't know if it's talk about Cinesamples at this point. You want me to do that real quick?
Yeah. Why not? Yeah.
All right. Let me see. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay. Well, all right. Pretend I'm talking at the beginning of the panel here. So yeah, Cinesamples, so I'm a composer. And it's my first setup when I moved here from New York, and using Giga Studio. I was doing a lot of work for some composers, and they would send me, you know, the handwritten sketch of their scores, because these were like guys who weren't as good with technology. They'd send it to me, and I would, you know, I started doing this work, creating mock-ups so that they could show the directors, you know, what the score was going to sound like. So we did a lot of this work, and I realized there were some gaps in the market. And so we did our first sample library in New York, and this was a small studio. We did a harp library. Yeah, I mentioned this is a library we did for $700. This cost the studio, the musician, and I did program it for Giga Studio. I did it all myself, just sort of chopping all the samples, doing the best I can to program this thing. And we put it up on a website that I made. There, I found the old website on the Wayback Machine. And, you know, put it on the vicontrol.net. I don't know if you guys are familiar with that place. That's where we started selling this library. I was like, wow, okay, interesting. People want to buy this stuff. And just kept making more libraries. Things became a little bit more ambitious. We started doing stuff up in Seattle. There's a great chapel up there at Bastyr University. We did 2 libraries, a choir library, Voxos, and some woodwind library, Hollywood Winds. You know, as we were doing this though, and we were selling boxed products and some digital downloads, we were looking at our competitors, and a lot of them were claiming to have this Hollywood sound, and they were still delivering these physical CDs. It's like, what if we actually could capture the Hollywood sound? No one seems to be doing it right. So like, okay, I grew up listening to John Williams, as all of us did probably. And I was like, what's the room that he always used? And this is the MGM scoring stage. This is where we do most of our recording. Those are some of the movies that we recorded that were recorded there. And I managed to connect with Dennis Sands was teaching at USC at the time. So I talked to him about, hey, would you want to do sampling with us? And he was totally open to it. And so he brought his decades of experience to the recording side of things. And we did our first kind of big library. It was Cinebrass in 2011. We actually did it under a AFM contract. It was all good. We made videos. It was really fun. It was really successful. And then we kind of went on and did the rest of the orchestra. And over the next, 7-8 years. And so a lot of top composers use our stuff. These are some of our customers, but we have tens of thousands of, customers all over the world that use our instruments. And one of the cool side benefits is we actually started a sort of a spin-off, a sister company called Hollywood Scoring, which is a music services contracting business. So, if you like the quality of the musicians and the samples you're using, well, you want to hire them, you just, you go over to Hollywood Scoring and we'll hook you up. That was kind of the idea.
That's cool.
And so that's something that has been growing kind of on the side. With our other partner, Newer Gladstone. So yeah, that's kind of the gist. That's kind of, I was hoping to start off with.
Nice, man. Yeah, thank you.
That's cool. Very cool.
Yeah, I need to definitely take part in the Hollywood Scoring eventually. Let's see here.
So yeah, we're trying to get into the whole streaming thing too.
Yeah.
Like we have our own scoring stage now, and smaller, not MGM size. It's a smaller room, but we've been doing some live streaming, and that way people can, like clients can be remote and watch, and you can actually record the musicians. There's actually COVID protocols for all of that stuff. Yeah. People 6 feet apart.
Oh yeah.
That's a whole other can of worms. Like, how do you get the sound, like with working within these restrictions?
Yeah.
And our head engineer over there, Adam Mihalik, he's got it all figured out. He's one of those super geniuses that has it all. But yeah, no, we have to adapt. This whole world has changed, right? And so.
Oh yeah.
Got to get on top of technology.
Cool. We have some more questions in the Q&A section. Do you want to take that third one down?
Oh,
From Chris, how do you test the samples?
sure. Yeah.
Sure.
Oh,
yeah.
they're laughing.
I would say
There's a
what?
story behind it.
We mash on the keyboard, and if something doesn't sound right, it's done. No. At every single point of the process, we actually have a quality control test. So export from Pro Tools, we have a quality control test. Export of samples from our internal software, there's a quality control test. And then finally, when it's in contact, I literally play through every single sample on the keyboard. Just to make sure it's all in, we're not getting any errors. I hear everything, I write with it. So automated tests are interesting. I've done a lot of automated tests on sampling, but it doesn't give us a whole picture. We can do things like pitch detection. We can do things like, is there how much space is at the beginning of the sample to some kind of peak value that's coming through, how much space is at the end of the sample. Is there samples that appear after the space at the end of the samples? We can do all that kind of, JSON scripts and stuff that we can run using, the multitude of freeware plugins that are out there. There's a company called Synaptic that just bought all of the, a lot of this testing stuff that we can do that is very helpful and certainly a nice little workflow. Myriad, I think, is the name of the software that they have. And you can just dump all your samples in there.
I use that.
Yeah, you can check everything, and they finally got resurrected. They were down for a year or so, but they're finally resurrected and working. And Synaptic's a great company. They really are coming out with a lot of great tools, and I'm excited that they're under that umbrella. It is Synaptic, right? I'm not just randomly going off the top of my head. I'm sorry if it's not Synaptic. But the program is called Myriad. So if you want to do some of your own QC work, that would be the first step without having to write some JSON scripts in terminal and running whatever that program is. That
it's both, right? So one is the super technical, going in there and doing whatever you just said, those big words. And then the other thing is, like, it has to just be great in a composer's hands, like from a creative standpoint. Because I mean, you could attest to this, Sam. We would do a test where you go through every note and everything, and it seems like it would be perfect, but then you put it in someone's hands to try to write with, and there's something off about it because we didn't try composing with it.
Yeah.
Right. So you got to do both. It's got to pass both tests.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, I try to write some kind of a demo. I do have a degree in composing. I do like to compose.
Use it.
So I do write music every once in a while. But I will write with it, and that is absolutely true. But from a very technical standpoint, from an automated QC testing, there is some level of that we do to try to speed up stuff. But my rule of thumb, if it takes longer to build the test than actually doing the test, then I probably won't do that automated test.
So what was the most difficult instrument to capture? What was the one that is just, you'll always look back on going, this was the terror?
I'm curious to hear Mike's perspective.
Strings are really hard, I have to say. Strings are difficult. Just because of, there's so many people. And so you're on the clock and you got to make sure you're getting it right. And, there's something about making it sound realistic that's a challenge.
They can sound very synthy if not done right.
Exactly.
Yeah. And so that would be, that would be my vote. What would you say, Sam?
Well, there are two instruments I have never been able to sample well, which have always eluded me, which is duduk and saxophone. Those to me are probably the two hardest instruments to sample. The most taxing instrument to sample is a piano, believe it or not. That is absolutely brutally taxing for anyone, because that ring out is brutal. It's like you're sitting there for 40 seconds on a ring out, and then you got to do the next dynamic. And if you're doing round robins, good Lord help you. but piano is the most taxing. But I'd say anything that is like a vocal like instrument where there are so many nuances and things to capture that, you know, trying to program this thing would be an absolute nightmare, not only for a composer and an interface, but also for us as sampling engineers to try to get this into a usable interface. So like the hardest percussion instrument would probably be the tabla, since it has like hundreds of different ways and different ways of capturing different articulations to different articulations.
Oh yeah.
Like tabla would be next to impossible to sample. So that's why you only have tabla loops out there. You know, and how useful is that in the end, you know, and how useful is an actual deduk library, you know, other than like a phrase library or something like that, if you really wanted to get it to sound good. But saxophones to me are the most elusive standard library that no one's been able to sample or capture right. And it's definitely on my list of, it's probably the one instrument I've never sampled to.
Yeah.
I think I've sampled just about every instrument that exists to some extent, but saxophone is the one thing I've never actually sampled.
There's something about the range of the saxophone and the sort of the readiness of it. It's kind of like, because we did soloists, solo voices, right? We did soprano, alto, tenor, and baritone. Soprano sounds great. Sounds very realistic. Alto sounds super realistic. As soon as you get to tenor, it's like, I don't know, something about that range.
Or it could have been the tenor we used.
Yeah.
I think for me, you know, there is something about the range, and maybe it's something that is something that has to be sampled chromatically, and maybe that's where we've missed the boat in some instances. But I think because you have everything here on your armature that controls all the little nuances on saxophone, especially from alighting one note to the next, and if you're trying to do jazz, good Lord, there's so much there that, you know, we're capturing one sample, one performance at a time, and if it's straight and stale, like that is not the saxophone. That absolutely cannot be the saxophone. But if you're recording a straight stale, you know, violin, it has a use case, you know, and it's not as varied from just kind of an instrument reproduction standpoint. The same with clarinet. Clarinet's pretty, like, it's just on, you know, a good old fashioned square wave, just right there, you know. But saxophone is not. It's a very strange instrument.
I feel like the quality of the recordings are always kind of funky sounding too, very synthetic. I think it's just the way it emits the top end. Maybe they use the wrong microphones. Possibly. I mean, I know of one, I'm not going to name the developer, but I mean, they created a very playable instrument, but just the quality of the recording was unusable in basically any production, you know, I ever tried to use it in. Yeah, so I've seen some developers have been getting into another type of sampling, which they call performance sampling. Have you guys done any research on that? Different methodology of capturing a performance rather than, you know, individual samples. So, you know, I think the developers are having players play pieces and then finding it's like a completely different theory, but they're basically extracting parts of performances, so and utilizing it.
Ultimately, we are capturing performances. So in terms of the methodology of creating a piece of music that captures every single, you know, interval, that captures every single you know, note, and then you play the chart at piano, play the chart at mezzo forte, play the chart at forte, or whatever to get your different dynamics, I think is a fascinating theory. The reason why I kind of discounted it and decided not to do that ages ago, because this was something that we had been talking about back in 2008 or whatever it was. And it's interesting to see people coming back to it now. This is not new. Okay. My thought and my methodology is that while you are getting a very interesting performance out of this thing, the consistency of the samples, which, you know, we talked about that fine line of like, is this a wabi-sabi instrument for sample versus a like super stale versus like non-usable? You've now introduced a massive amount of variables into the situation. And so you can get a little bit more into that wabi-sabi nature of the samples, where it's a little bit more performed. Maybe they're, growing the sample a little bit, or, changing the dynamic as they hit. If they're doing a good, nice minor seventh leap into a thing, they're gonna approach it a little bit longer, and it's just gonna get a little more sweepy and whatnot. But when you come back to the instrument and you're going from one dynamic to the next dynamic, I want some level of consistency between those performed samples. I want some level of consistency of the timbre of the dynamic that's hitting that sample. I want some level of consistency in that sustain. So that way, when I'm looping in it, I'm not getting wow, wow, wow. I'm not getting all this weird stuff going on. And the moment you put yourself into a performed based sample set, all of a sudden you've now introduced all of that wildness back into the samples, which there is a merit to it. There is a place for it. I totally understand and appreciate that approach. And it's not a wrong approach. Please don't get me wrong. It's not for me. There's too many variables now to put in. I'd rather sit at a session, go through note by note by note. Yeah, it makes the performers feel like crap. It makes us feel like crap. It's not fun. But at least I can go, hey guys, we've been going through this dynamic process, and we're creeping up in dynamic, and this timbre is just not quite right. Let's get back to here. Let's redo this. And maybe this is a dynamic that we actually want to approach at a different point in this session.
Perfect. We have a question in the Q&A about impulse responses.
Oh yeah, I see that. Did you guys make an impulse response reverb of a space, the MGM stage? So we wanted to record a live instrument and place it in that space. It sounds more natural. Yeah, well, there's some, MGM is they're kind of skittish about, depending where you are. They don't like the impulse response. They always yell at us, like when we're out there, like snapping something or whatever. They're like, wait, are you guys doing an impulse response? No. Yeah, they don't like it. I mean, I'll just say we do have one, but we can't use it. Like we can't give it out.
Right.
But yeah,
I have very strong feelings on it, and I don't know if I want to go down that rabbit hole.
But yeah.
Tim,
go ahead.
Go ahead. Sorry, you go ahead.
I do have a collection of impulse responses, but I don't like impulse responses in general. They are the most stalest form of a room capture that I've ever seen in my life. Yep. And I'm still waiting for the day someone actually can design a proper impulse engine that can actually capture what's happening in a room. It gives you a general RT of kind of what's coming, but it's just like, I end up using IRs more for sound design purposes than for anything else. I tend to gravitate towards really good algorithmic reverbs to actually do my reverbing. But there is nothing that beats the sound of an actual room, which is why we go to these stages to record the instruments in actual rooms so we can actually capture that sound properly.
I agree. There's something about IRs that are just not musical. They don't sit into a mix in a musical way.
Yeah, you don't get the quadratic buildup effect. It just doesn't happen. And you can do that a lot better in synthetic reverbs. But in IRs, unless you multi-sample an IR and actually have an engine that can actually go through a multi-sampled IR as well as a varied IR in terms of like not only position, but that you can actually break down better the early reflections, where they're building up in the room, how much buildup of a certain frequency you have in a room to be able to get that. Like you got to do a lot of ML learning to really get a good IR response with lots of different IRs to really capture a room properly. I know there's a lot of companies out there working on this right now, and I'm excited to see that because they're finally capturing and getting it. I mean, IRs that like there's really not much to making an IR. They're not special in any means. So
then the question just popped up of, do you have a preferred algorithmic verb?
Many.
Ricasti M7. Is that
algorithm? For outboard gear, yes, for sure.
You guys sampled that, didn't you?
Yeah, no, and we got permission to do IR. to do
Nice.
IR sweeps of the Bricasti, and it does
Yeah.
not do it justice.
No, it's terrible. For outboard Earcam has done some of the best for me. They've done a lot of the best reverbs out there. They're just super processor intensive. I also like a lot of what 2C Audio is doing. I think they have some really interesting algorithmic reverbs. I guess I'm always going to say Synaptic and question myself. Isotopes just bought a company. That guy really knows what he's doing.
Exponential Audio,
Yeah,
my favorite.
He
Absolutely.
really knows what he's doing.
Yep.
Best bang for your buck would obviously be the Phoenix stuff. Like that stuff is spectacular
And it's in
best bang.
surround sound. They got surround
Yep.
version of it. Fantastic.
Yep.
Hmm.
So yeah, I would highly recommend that.
So Tim, do you want to let Chris Nograti know about AES Nashville?
I actually was just grabbing a link and stuff.
Yeah, I was as well, but I'd rather you talk.
So we'll post the link to that. But really, if you just type in AES Nashville, you'll get to our website that has all the information and stuff. And we actually have members from all over. North Alabama is certainly not far from Nashville in the overall scheme of things. Exactly. Yeah. I used to be on the committee for Central Texas, which was all of Texas and some of Louisiana. So we never had people at meetings, that were beyond 100-mile scope. So being able to do this type of stuff now with Zoom and a discussion of when we do meetings in the future where we're finally able to get back together in a room or meet at a studio or whatever, hang time, we're trying to figure out a way that we can still have it online too for people who are a little bit farther out of the area. They can join in also and see presentations, ask questions, get answers and stuff. So please check out AES Nashville's website. Just do a search on Google, it comes up immediately. And you're welcome to check out any of these ones that we're doing online. Obviously you don't have to be a member for a lot of this stuff. When we start meeting in person again, it would be great if you become a member and get involved. It's just a stunning amount of resources just as far as the members. I'm blown away still. I mean, I've been full-time now for over 20 years in this career, and I get to sit with these guys where I feel like I haven't done anything. I have absolutely no career in my life, and I get to talk with these guys in AES that have a lifetime of experience on the biggest albums and recording sessions that you can imagine. And it's invaluable, the amount of information. People talk about going to college to learn about recording. You sit in a room and talk to somebody for a half hour, for an hour about how their favorite way of miking a snare drum or whatever it is. It's just, that's college. That's the real thing. Finding out how the pros are actually laying the rubber down against the road. It's awesome. So anyway, there you go. A spiel.
All right. Well, do we have any more questions? I mean, I'm dry now.
Yeah, I'm dry. It's been great. It's been a really good learning experience.
Yeah. I really appreciate you guys coming out and, giving us the rundown.
Yeah.
Let's see here.
Yeah. Oh, one more.
Yeah.
Just popped up. If you want to grab that, go for it. And then we'll call tonight.
Let's see.
Latency and sample playback. That's all I saw pop up on my screen.
Hold on. He's typing.
Hang on. Takes me a second. Well, I'll ask this real fast. So when Gigasampler, when Tascam bought it and politely placed it in the trash can, and your business model was based around that.
Well, thankfully, Contact was starting to become.
Were you guys already on? Were you guys already?
Yeah, we were already. It was Contact 2. I think we started making instruments in that, and then I forget the order of things, but it became available on Mac, which was the biggest thing, and then also they implemented the direct from disk streaming,
right?
Because that was the thing that made Giga Studio so great. You can have these massive instruments, so they implemented that, and then that was like, okay, this is the standard now, I suppose. And you could just load it up as a plugin in your MIDI sequence. Couldn't really do that with Giga Studio.
Right.
I got the question.
Okay.
Yes, there's lots of techniques. So you have basically 3 stages of latency. Very first one is your MIDI latency, whatever software you're using to grab MIDI from your keyboard into your device, whether or not that's through a direct interface from the keyboard, or you're actually going through a Mode 2 interface or a MIDI man interface if you got a bunch of old gear in your studio and you're just trying to get stuff hooked up. From there can be latency introduced by your OS. On the USB end of things, some power management issues that you may want to look into if you're having problems there. A quick way to test is basically to pull up your DAW, press note, and if you immediately see it pop open, then it's probably not a MIDI problem. It's probably on your audio interface. So if it's on your audio interface, you need to look at your buffer settings. So the buffers, it'll say anything from 64 to 128, 256, 512, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The higher your buffer is, the more latency you're going to get. So if you start really noticing the latency at about 512 to 124. So if you're set higher to that on your audio card buffer, you're going to starting to feel the latency. If none of those are the problem, and the reason why you'd have higher buffer sizes so you can actually process audio, because it buffers the audio to allow for processing. So it takes CPU stress and other stress away from your system. Beyond that, samples themselves can have latency built into them, and this is something that I developed a while ago to capture pre-transients in a sample. So if you notice like a snare drum or even a piano, there's a before the actual sound hits, and that's actually what causes the sound to bloom. It causes a lot of just gorgeousness and beauty in the samples before the note actually is struck. And so it's the pre-transient response. So I usually cut samples a little bit ahead of time. So usually 5 milliseconds, 10 milliseconds, which you'll never really detect if you're playing it. But if you have a bunch of latency, it starts adding up. And we do build things, like cutting into the samples and sample start times and whatnot. But this basically allows us to have that breadth of sample into the thing. And so while you're recording in, one of the tricks to do is have 2 lines, especially if you're dealing with a lot of latency. Most of my samples, like, you're not going to notice the latency. But if you do have a lot of latency, especially like Voxos, when you're recording like fa or la, the downbeat isn't until you hit the ah. And so there's this huge amount of latency. And so what you do is you have one track that has the sample start time cut into it, and that's your performance track. Mm-hmm. And then you drop it down to a track that has the offset built into it. And in the manual, it says exactly what the offset is. Typically, it's 250 milliseconds for Voxos, I think. But that'll shift all the MIDI over. And so everything actually is in time. Because if you notice, with a lot of vocal libraries are the hard ones. Because if you notice a lot of vocal libraries, it'll be like ka, fa, la, na, and you're like, yeah. you can't use it. Yep. And so you have to build in this very consistent pre-roll or offset, downbeat offset into all the samples. That's just what we have to deal with. So again, the way to work around that is to cut into the samples, have that be your performance track, or have something else be your performance track so you can get the MIDI in if you're a live performer, and then drop it down to a track that's been offset. And all DAWs have offsets. So.
Right.
Are there any?
If you crank down your buffer setting on your audio card as far as it will go, you're getting trouble. You're having to run it at a higher buffer setting. Obviously, you look at the computer, but also look at the audio driver from the audio company manufacturer. Because, example, RME, their drivers are absolutely stellar, tight, fantastic. But then you get another company, and I won't give out a name, where it works, their drivers work, but they don't necessarily work as efficiently to allow you to get such a good buffer setting. And so that's, if you've already tried getting it to a workable number, like a 256 buffer setting, and it's just not working, your computer's not keeping up, really do look at your audio interface and the software driver behind it.
Gotcha. Okay.
what I was about to ask.
Yeah, the one other thing on a contact level. So Mike mentioned this DFD or direct from disk thing that contact does. If you have a slow disk, the way you can tell you're having a slow disk is when you press a sample and I'll go, you'll hear a little bit of the sample and then it'll drop out and then you start hearing the sample again. That's when you know you're having disk issues. So if you're on like an older if you're on a platter drive that's like a 5400 RPM, you're going to have problems. If you're on 7200, you're probably okay. But obviously we recommend going everything to SSD. And the nice thing about going to SSD is in contact, you can lower that pre-roll buffer. This is not the same thing as a pre-roll to a sample, but it's the amount of sample loads into memory. You can actually lower that and you'll drop your memory usage in your computer. So if you only have like 32 gigs of memory or 16 gigs of memory and you're starting to hit that wall, you can go in, especially if you have an SSD, drop all your samples onto your SSD, take that DFD size down so you're minimizing the sample load that you have on every single sample you're bringing in. And then that will also help there.
Yes,
any SSD work?
Yes, SSD works fantastic for audio. I have no spinning drives anymore in my system. I have 6 SSDs, and then all of my USB drives for storage are all spinners.
And they're not expensive.
Oh, they're so cheap. Your computer's so quiet, so cool. Yeah.
Yeah.
I have recently upgraded to NVMe drives on my machine, and it is insane.
Even faster.
Like it's just like there's almost no loading. I have in Logic, I just have a button that I click to load up the entire Cinebrass library, and it's like it's just unbelievable.
It's stupid. It is stupid fast now. So you can go into contact now if you are using SSDs, and yes, actually pretty much any SSD will work, especially modern ones. In terms of the type of flash memory, and now you're asking me to dig deep into my technical specs. RAND, is that whatever it is, the type of chips that they use. There's, I'm not going to get too technical into this, but there's basically a garbage collection thing that happens on the SSD when they have bad read write states. They create a garbage collection, so it knows not to write to those spots. The modern drives all have that. You don't have to worry about it. It's called trimming. So the good ones are like Western Digital. Obviously, Samsung pretty much makes the best ones. They just now came out with their 870 EVOs, which are spectacular. But you are limited to 512 on those for your speed until the next iteration of SATA comes out. But going to NVMe, which is a direct injection into your PCI bus instead of having to go through a SATA bus, you'll triple your speed, especially with PCI 4. That's about to hit the market. It's going to be faster than your RAM. And so at that point, it's pointless because your RAM's not your bottleneck. Right. So we're going to get to the point. It's just like, it's stupid. Just don't, like, an SSD is just fine for samples. Like, absolutely just fine.
Something also to mention about SSDs, because we all thought, hey, now that we don't have a spinning platter and such, that these drives, SSDs, will last forever. They don't. SSDs will last longer, most likely, but they do die. I've had a couple die already out of 10 or 11. I've had a couple that have gone bad and died. And also, if they're not plugged into your system, if you're trying to use them as storage, they need to really be plugged in like once every 6 months to 9 months. Otherwise, they will die.
Well, you think about it, it is a little electrical switch.
Yep.
It's just, that's all it is. And that switch can only happen so many times. And that's why that trim data collection or garbage collection is on there. Because they know they're going to fail, because it's just a little electrical switch that's constantly going back and forth. Turn on and off zeros and ones.
A bunch of them.
A lot of them.